All Tomorrows, a billion-year chronicle of the myriad species and mixed fortunes of man, by C.M. Kosemen. A reading, Part 7. Satyriacs, descendants of the Hedonists. Their pleasure-drenched existence, locked between their static paradise world and their inherently slow pace of evolution, seemed immune to change. Perhaps this was true for 1,000,000 years or so, but on larger scales, complete stasis was a fable. During a particular era, geologic upheavals threw up huge masses of land over the shallow oceans of their world. The Hedonists, until then trapped on a singular island no bigger than today's Iceland, were not late to colonize these new pastures. This was more of a necessary exodus, since the events that raised the new lands had also thrown up enormous clouds of ash that smothered the atmosphere and blocked out the sun. Their innocence finally spoilt, most of the Hedonists died out, unable to adapt. The only survivors were fast-breeding freaks who had abandoned the reproductive quirks of their ancestors. It was these forms that colonized the newborn continent and gave rise to a multitude of species, which included the Satyriacs, sentient heirs to the Hedonists. These beings resembled their ancestors to a great degree, except that they now sported enormous tails, boneless organs of balance woven out of extended pelvic muscles and fat. Along this appendage, their entire bodies were reoriented in horizontal, almost dinosaurian postures. Although they had abandoned the frantic reproductive strategies of their ancestors, their social lives still retained a delightful tint of casual promiscuity. The Satyriac civilization was quick to establish itself globally, for even with the additional land masses, the terrestrial domain of their world remained no larger than Australia. For a while, 3 and then 2 land empires competed each other, before dissolving into a myriad smaller nations and finally reunifying into a coherent world order. From this point on, the Satyriac world once again became a Valhalla of pleasure, with festivals, concerts, and ritualized orgies punctuating every working week. This time, however, it could all be savoured by true intelligence. Bug faces, descendants of the insectophagi. Over time, their insectivorous ancestors came to resemble their prey. Hardened, leathery faceplates, once used for defense against stings and bites, ossified and became integrated into the jaw structure. Their hands and feet, with reduced numbers of fingers and toes, developed into pincer-like affairs. Even their metabolism reverted partially into ectothermy in the balmy, lazy climate of their planet. But it was none of those adaptations that gave them the edge in survival. Simply put, a congenital defect allowed them to regain their sentience. Even after the smothering by the Q, the genes of the star people remained dormant in their cells. Through pure coincidence, one lineage of the insectophagi developed an atavistic throwback, resulting in larger brains, which just happened to be useful in cracking open insect nests with crude stone tools. It was all downhill from there onwards. Although millennia long in itself, the development from stone axe to spaceship was an eye blink in geological time. Like many other species, the bug facers passed through consecutive cycles as agrarian, in their case hive farming empires, colonial endeavors, industrialization, massive world wars, and finally, globalized world states. But there was one thing that set their development apart from all other post-human species. They faced another alien invasion. History does not record much about the invaders, except that, unlike the Q, theirs was a singular effort and it was beaten off in an intense cycle of orbital and terrestrial wars. Although vanquished, the invaders did succeed in leaving behind their traces. They introduced their own flora and fauna, which flourished on the bug-facer home planet long after they departed. More importantly, they imbibed the poor bug facers with a pathological interspecies xenophobia to the point that they were fearful even of their own post-human cousins on other stars. Through an ironic twist of fate, their fears would be more than justified, though not just yet. The bug faces still had time. Asteromorphs, descendants of the Spacers. Initially refugees, the Spacers were quick to master the vastness of interstellar space. Their isolated space arcs joined together and multiplied to form a gigantic, interlocked artifact that was large enough to contain entire worlds. But no planets lay inside the Asteromorph capital, only cavernous, gravity-free bubbles where the inhabitants could finally develop to their fullest. Freed from the constraints of weight, their bodies grew spindly and insectile, with individual digits extending into multitudes of thin, versatile limbs. Other than these, the only developed organs were their derived jet sphincters, which went on to become the principal means of locomotion. But above all were their brains, their bulging, swollen brains. With no hindrance from gravity, the human brain could grow into unprecedented sizes. Each generation devised experiments that produced offspring with greater cranial capacity, giving rise to beings who went through their everyday lives thinking in concepts and structures scarcely comprehensible to people of today. Their physiological limitations of the human mind had been long since debated. Now it was established that these limits were indeed real, and individuals who could break them would likewise conquer new grounds in philosophy, art, and science. Everything changed. Yet some aspects of humanity, such as the basic desire to expand, remained. To this end, the Asteromorphs built great fleets of globular sub-arcs and spread their influence across the heavens into every stellar cluster and every star system. Within less than 1,000 years, the galaxy was straddled by a new and far more alien empire of man. Strangely enough, its dominion included none of the newly emerging post-human species, for its masters had completely lost interest in planets, those stunting, gravity-chained balls of dirt and ice. The newborn arcs settled comfortably into the outer rims of star systems, quietly observing the lives of their struggling relatives. For the first time in history, there were actual gods in the myriad human skies. They were silent and weren't even noticed for most of the time, but their watchfulness was ultimately going to pay off. Second Galactic Empire. Over time, the sentient post-humans began to reach out to the galaxy. They inevitably stumbled across the ruins of the Starmen and figured out their interstellar ancestry. These discoveries were followed by a realization that there might be others like them, unimaginable distances away. Thus, the fledgling civilizations set about to probing the skies. The contacts, all established by radio communication, were not spread out evenly. The Empire began little more than a few million years after the Q left, with the first dialogue between the earliest killerfolk and the Satyriacs. A few thousand years later, they were joined by the Tool Breeders, hailing out from the ocean depths through living radio arrays. The second wave of sentient species joined in during the following 10 million years as the modular whole, Pterosapiens, and the fledgling Asymmetrics contacted their celestial cousins. Finally, in the next 20 million years, newly evolving civilizations such as the Soros, Snake People, Parasite/Symbiotes, and the Sail People successively contacted the burgeoning Galactic Empire. The bug facers were aware of the whole process, but due to their xenophobic experience, they only opened up after a staggering 40 million years in silence. This union was an empire of speech, for actual travel between the stars was too difficult to be practical. Like the bygone colonies of the Starmen, the post-humans cooperated through the unrestricted exchange of information and experience. Although covering every aspect of an astonishing variety of cultures, the Empire's efforts focused on the two main issues: political unification, though not homogenization, and galactic awareness, constant readiness for possible alien invasions, Everybody had come across the remains of the mysterious Q. Nobody wanted a repeat of the same scenario. When the Second Empire ran into the Asteromorphs, who had silently saturated the galaxy with their own empire of man, they feared the worst. But luckily for them, the godlike beings were not interested in the Second Empire, nor any of its worlds. The Asteromorphs were given a wide berth and accepted as they were, incomprehensible, omnipotent forces of nature. This coordinated effort lasted for almost 80 million years, during which its member species attained previously unimaginable levels of culture, welfare, and technology. Each species colonized a few dozen worlds of their own, in which nations, cultures, and individuals lived to the fullest potentials of their existence. Needless to say, all of this was possible only through constant communication and a total openness to the galaxy. Most communities took this for granted and dutifully participated in the galactic dialogues. But there were others, silent, darkened beings who refused to join in. Through them would come the ruin of the Empire.